Solvents and Oils. As you will remember from our discussion on oil paint, the oil is just the binder for the pigment. So when you're painting, if you want to thin your paint, I would use oil. I would not use a solvent like mineral spirits. For the most part, mineral spirits and other solvents are simply used to clean your brush. You can use it occasionally if you're comfortable with it, but what happens is the solvents break down the binder and the oil and you get a very grainy effect with your paint. If that's something you want, then go for it. But otherwise, just use the solvents to clean your brushes. Let's talk about solvents first. Solvents, the one I recommend is the low odor mineral spirits. There are odorless mineral spirits, which you can certainly use, but I find that for some reason, and I don't know what it is, they don't have as much oomph. They don't do the cleaning job that I want it to do. There's also the matter of the consistency. You want clear liquids for your mineral spirits. They do make a low odor mineral spirit and an odorless mineral spirit that's got kind of a milky white color to it. It's almost impossible to tell when your brush is clean, so don't get the milky white, get the clear, I would just get this grade from your hardware store or paint store. It's perfectly good for cleaning brushes. A gallon of this is probably 20 bucks. If you go to the art store and buy a little tiny one like this, it may also be 20 bucks. So make sure that you use the cheaper one because it's good for what it needs to be. Otherwise, you could use turpentine, which is what I keep in here. This is a hazard, OSHA approved toxic chemical container because turpentine is toxic. It's made from tree resin, and that's what used to be used to clean brushes and so forth, and thin paint down. And I still use it occasionally, but it's a little more toxic. So don't use turpentine unless you are a traditionalist and you've got to have the original materials. I would avoid it. But if you want to try it, go ahead and try it. Just make sure you paint in a well-ventilated area. Every time that you use your solvents, even with the odorless and the low odor solvents, you're going to get fumes. And the fumes add to the terrible reputation of oil paint being toxic. It's not that toxic. You can get paint on your hands, and it's not really going to affect you. By the way, if you want to get paint off your hands, Gojo or Goop, which is where you'll find those at like an auto parts store. They're for mechanics to get car grease off their hands, but it also works great on oil paint. Other than mineral spirits and turpentine, I wouldn't use anything else. Don't use gasoline. Don't use acetone. Don't use lacquer thinner. Don't use kerosene. All those things are very, very toxic. Even with good ventilation, you want to stay around that stuff as little as you can. Also, make sure that you don't smoke while you're using these solvents. I know that seems obvious, but man, you start looking back at Jackson Pollock, who would smoke while he painted and cleaned his brushes, and you want to be like Jackson Pollock. Unless you want your face burned off, don't smoke around the solvents. Just avoid it. No candles either. No incense, nothing, no open flames or embers. All right, let's talk about oils. The most common oil is linseed oil. Remember, the purpose of oil is a binder for the pigment. So if you want to extend some paint, you've got that one shade that you can't mix again, add a little oil to it and it'll stretch a little farther. With regard to linseed oil, it has some pros and cons. There's the boiled linseed oil, which is typically if it just says linseed oil, this is boiled linseed oil. And then there is cold pressed linseed oil. Cold pressed it comes from the flaxseed, and it takes longer to dry. I don't really use that. I'll just use the standard linseed oil. It does have the potential to maybe slightly yellow over time, and by time I mean 100 years, 150 years. So if you're concerned about archival qualities, don't be, because you're not Picasso. You're not making little treasures and icons for a cathedral. Just paint what you want and don't worry about it. Let the conservatives worry about removing the yellowing from your painting after 200 years. It's perfectly fine. I would, however, recommend artist grade linseed oil over the gallon can of linseed oil that you can buy at the paint store. That type of oil is a lower grade, and it definitely does yellow in a year or two, and it gets gummy. It gets a little skin on it after a while, especially if you use a lot of it to thin your paint down. It's not what you want, so get the artist grade linseed oil. If you want to experiment with other oils, that's certainly your prerogative, and you can do that. One that I like to use is walnut oil. This is a cooking grade walnut oil, which is the same walnut oil that you can get at the art supply store. It's cheaper if you get it from the grocery store, and it's perfectly safe. I like to do that for my students, just to give them a little wake up. So walnut oil dries clearer than linseed oil. It's a tad more expensive, but it's just fine. You can also get safflower oil or poppy seed oil. All of those things work just fine, and they're very similar. I would also recommend an investment in Liquin, which is made by Winsor & Newton. It's a glazing medium. It comes in a little gel. And it really gives you some nice subtle gradations whenever you get down to blending your paints. So Liquin is good. The last chemical or material I'll talk about briefly is gesso. Gesso is what you'll use to prime a board or a canvas, if that's what you paint on, to give you a nice sealed background. Otherwise, your material is going to be very porous. Your substrate will be very porous, and it won't accept the paint like you want it. You can buy artist grade gesso if you like, which I do sometimes, or you can use latex white flat house paint. It does the same thing. Kills does the same thing. All you want to do is seal that surface, so make sure you use water-based gesso for easy cleanup. And that should cover it for solvents and oils.